Hey, what's good with the YouTube, man? It's your boy Rojo, Convict's Perspective, joined as always by my co-host Big Flacco. And you know he's mashing and dashing and sliding on through. He's doing all that shit. Me, I'm way too cool to do all that. Anyway, today we're going to talk about, as you can tell, the Nortenos and the Bulldogs. Flacco came up with a good topic for us today, man. And I'm going to let him run with it and see where it takes us.
So we're going to be talking about Norteno versus Bulldogs, right? But there's a twist to this whole breakdown today, man, and it's a convict perspective. First and foremost, let's just talk about a little bit about the history, Nortenos and Bulldogs, right? You could talk to about 5 OG Bulldogs, 5 OG Norteno structure NF members, right? And you're going to hear about 10 different stories about how the Bulldogs formed. Needless to say, they're here. We know the boiling point started to turn over in the 80s, more so in the 90s. But even during that time era, there was still not, I won't say resistance, but there was still like a little bit of love and respect that the Norte and Bulldogs had amongst each other. I don't think the Bulldogs evolution was just on purpose. I think that a lot of them just wanted to separate themselves from the NF politics, the structure, big homies, and so forth, right? But I posed a serious question to Rojo earlier, and I was talking to Gunnar about it. Where do you think the Norte would be if the Bulldogs never left the fold, if they were still actively in the mix? Because there's a lot of things that kind of blew things out of proportion in the 90s. You talk to a lot of old school Bulldogs, and a lot of them will say, we never wanted to leave the Norte. We just wanted to be able to coexist and do our own thing. And so I was playing things out, man. I'm thinking, you know, we've heard, I've been hearing this since the 90s, bro, since like 91 years old when I was a kid. I would see homeboys get out from YA, talk to OGs, and they were pushing this thing called city life structure at the time, right? City vida, you know what I mean? You know, San Jose and Fresno did have a serious conflict in YA. And that whole issue started to overlap over as well into the prison system as well. You know what I'm saying? Bear in mind, back in the 80s and early 90s, it was a little bit different during that time era. You didn't have like the Norte as far as a united front, as far as you were Norteño there as a representation. When it was time to get off of the Sureños, you got off. But you had cars back then. You had the Sanjo car, Fresno car, Salas car, Stockton car. And who were the 2 biggest cars in the system, whether you were in prison or YA? Sanjo and Salinas. I mean, Sanjo and Fresno, excuse me. Those were the 2 biggest cars. So when Fresno left the fold, this kind of took things back for the Norte in a whole different direction. It brought the numbers down. It brought the leadership down. It brought the morale down. And it also gave treadway to a lot of other factions later on down the lines that decided to do their own thing.
Yeah, man. When I first came into the system in the early 90s, man, you know, there was obviously already a split, but there was a lot of people still lingering, you know, that were kind of undecided. And like the first yard I landed on, there was about 5 individuals from Fresno that still were rocking with the Northern movement as a whole. But at the same time, there was probably 20 or 30 of them in the hole over on Lassen. You know what I mean? Before they kicked them out. I don't even know where they sent them after that. But I was with a few of them, man. And our policy at the time was just to keep an eye on them. You know, and this is 93. We weren't told to engage yet. We weren't told to do any of this. Just keep an eye on them, make sure they're not up to nothing, and still treat them as our own, but skeptically. You know what I mean? So it wasn't all the way done yet. Man, them guys, man, I kicked it with a couple of them, man, especially one older one, man. He was a cool dude, bro. He was just like us. You know what I mean? And, you know, by the time I ended up on the 3 yard, like a year and a half later, it was all the way over. It was nobody from Fresno could be on the yard, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, you just watch it develop from there, from the city of Fresno to the county dogs to all the little surrounding towns around there start to go that way as well. And like you said, man, it's a huge loss of manpower. I mean, that is a huge area. There's over 500,000 people in Fresno. You know what I mean? And a lot of them have a long, rich history with the Norte. You know what I mean? So losing that stronghold with that history, that amount of soldiers, and we all know the Bulldogs, there's nothing soft about them. You know what I mean? They're the only group that has managed to walk away from another main group and still be around basically and not have to go to SNY and all that kind of stuff. A lot of people say, yeah, but they have their own yards where Norteños aren't on there. That's
They
not
fought
up
for
to
that
them.
though.
That's not up to them. That's an administrative decision as to where they house them. You can't just go to the captain and be like, I want to go to a prison where there's active Northerners. It just doesn't work like that. They're going to put you where they're going to put you. And at the same time, they're not going to program with any funny style people. They're not going to program with chomos. They're not going to program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And no matter what you say about them, they're an active prison group. They haven't been able to get rid of them. There's too many of them, and they're about that action. Losing them was horrible. It was horrible.
Yeah, because you right there, you instantly lose about 20 to 30,000, members. I mean, and in our, when we were in the system, bro, I mean, people don't understand this, and this is the reality of it, man. Being a Norteño prison was hard enough. We're outnumbered in every yard. We have to do everything to secure ourselves, man. There's opposition everywhere. I've only been in very few places. Maybe Quinton was one place. And even in Solano, the numbers were pretty close most of the time, man. But every place I've been, we've been the minority to whites. We've been the minority to blacks. We've been the minority to Sureños. We've even been the minority to most paisas as well, bro. So losing those numbers, you know what I mean? Can you imagine? Those numbers would have been a little bit different. The odds would have been a little bit different on these yards. It would have been a little bit less stressful, man. And certain yards, we would have been able to be established because we would have had more manpower to have some of these lineas. As soon as the Bulldogs came into the fold, we started to lose a whole lot. I say our past affiliations, we started to lose a lot of footholds in a lot of facilities. That Bulldog split was a big thing. You know what I'm saying? And now it's generational. The mindset and attitude as far as the Bulldog thinking process. But even back then, man, in the 80s, when it first started to take place around 85, 86, whenever you want to say it really started happening, there was still those that wanted to align with the Norte beliefs. And they were also still allowed to coexist out there in the yard. Politics weren't how they were today. You know what I'm saying? The whole purpose of the Bulldogs' whole format, foundation, whatever you want to call it, was to walk the yards free of bonds. They wanted to do what they wanted to do on these yards, but just as individuals, as convicts. They wanted to take it back to how it was the old ways. You know what I'm saying? The influence of the criminal organizations and the threat of oppression by your own people, the favoritism, the set tripping. You know what I mean? Let's just keep it real. I think I was talking to someone, right? And this is just a perspective, okay? This is not factual. But I think during this time era, around 89 to 91, 92, NYA in prison, it was well recognized and it was well documented that San Jose and Fresno had conflict a lot of times on these lineas, at these YAs, at these facilities. I'm thinking that may have contributed to pushing the Bulldogs even farther away because it came a conflict. Who was a bigger car? Who was stronger? Who was more with the business? You know what I'm saying? And those two cars were the two biggest cars. And there was a lot of dirty politics. There was a lot of campaigning. There was a lot of scandalous stuff that was going on. No one wants to really talk about that. This whole rift of separation was kind of created within. It's like you have two people vying for the top, and one thinks that they're the older brother, they're going to treat the other one like a dirty stepsister, but yet they're all capable of being on that same level.
Right.
So personally, I think if there wasn't this car and set tripping at that time in the 80s and 90s, I think that they would have still been brought in the fold. But I also think that the Norteño versus Bulldog separation also opened the doors for people like the New Flowers, who any active New Flower that I've talked to do not acknowledge themselves as being an SNY group. They push for the same agenda to be on these main lines. They have almost the same philosophy as a Bulldog. But it also opened doors for the SNY. It also opened doors for the Northern Riders. All these different groups started to spur after everybody seen what the Bulldogs did. Because the Norte in general, man, that's from Delano on up. At that time, 80 and 90s, the upstaters were not really a threat up north yet. So you had a whole group faction that decided to walk and go on their own. You know what I mean? And, like I said, I think if Fresno was still in the fold, right, during the 90s, we would have a whole different thing going on. The unity was still there, but like everything, man, it's always about haterism. It's always about people that want to be at the top, egos. When people start to do that, man, it starts to build division and dissension. When people start to hate on each other, you're supposed to be part of the same group. It brings nothing but division. Therefore, you're going to have people campaigning. Therefore, you're going to have people taking sides. I mean, you see it all the time in the real world. That's just the reality of it. And I think that's what happened with the Fresno thing, man. I don't think that their intentions was to be like a Bulldog and totally separate. I think that just formed and built on its own. That's just a personal opinion. I know that they had the Bulldog Council that for a minute, they had the little, there was like a statement that was written, the declaration. I get all that. But even for years after that, when you had this separation, you still had those from Fresno that were still loyal to the Norte, even as Bulldogs.
You know what's a trip, man, is there's at least 3 versions of why it happened. You know, the first one I heard was crackers. This is the first one I heard. Can't verify it, I wasn't there. Crackers and chicken legs, 2 NF members, ran off with a bunch of money. And when the main group sent people after them, they told their little homies in Fresno that the NF was just trying to do them dirty. They didn't steal nothing. It was about the homeboys in San Jose not liking the homeboys in Fresno. That's the first story I ever heard. Then it was crackers and another individual from Fresno pulled somebody under their wing in prison and started extorting him. And when they got told no, it was a big issue and it ended up with a stabbing incident. Then there was just the simply straight up set tripping between San Jose and Fresno that ran them off. And like
There's
all
one
these,
more, there's one more, Rojo. There's the claims of Sammy Venegas in crackers flipping, allegedly. Sammy Venegas was one time a lieutenant within the NF at that time, a high-ranking lieutenant. They actually killed his brother, so there was always bad blood between him and the NF. There was also the theory that Sammy Loco and Flaco from Fresno, who were down as informants, Sammy Loco, of course, being Sammy Venegas, that Crackers was instructed to take him out. And instead of doing what he was supposed to do, he favoritized the individuals from Fresno. So there's all kinds of different theories. And I could sit there and talk to a Bulldog that says, I was there. And I could talk to another one that says I was there. And they all have a different theory, man. There's just a myth of how the Bulldogs really formed. And that has to make me believe that I think some of every story that we hear has to have somewhat a little bit of truth, but it's not a one-sided story. It's not just what the NF claims happened. You got to take into consider what the Bulldogs claimed happened as well. Yeah. And so I think there was other mitigating factors that started to give full to this being true. And like I said, I think one of the biggest things that people don't talk about with the Fresno Bulldogs separating themselves was the conflict that Fresno always had with San Jose. That is well recognized. That started kicking off in Wyatt in prison. We got to remember, it was a different time era. The structure that you see with Nortenos and manpower today, household policies, yard policy procedures, NAQs and all that, they weren't doing that in the 80s. You just came to a prison, you showed your paperwork, you gave them your name, and you acknowledged within 72 hours whether you were a bro or a C. That was it back then. You know what I mean? You didn't have to fall on fire with a chain of command. They would pick and choose from times someone that they felt could hold a building security position or a tier security position or this and that, right? But all those that were in the chain of command positions would be Northern Structure members or Nuestra members, whatever you want to call it. So therefore, you'd have these different individuals on the yard. If the yard was well established, there was 150, 200 homeboys, you'd have 30 homeboys over there from Stockton kicking it, another 25 homeboys over there from Fresno kicking it, another 30 homeboys from San Jose over there. That's how it was. I was told that before I went to prison, that because I was from Santa Clara County, I was going to have to run with a Saho car. Literally. This was in the 90s. You didn't have all this stuff that you had now. Therefore, depending on what yard you were on, it's the same thing that happened like in Tracy for a minute. You had a dude that was in charge of Tracy that was from Stockton. He favoritized everybody from Stockton. So you could be at a facility where there's someone from Saho that's representing it. Therefore, he may have a dislike towards Fresno. Those are the kind of things that nobody wants to talk about that were going on in the 80s and 90s that I think had a big factor in the Bulldogs saying, man, fuck these dudes out here from San Jose. Fuck these dudes from the Bay. You know what I mean? They don't care about Fresno. Why are we getting shitted on? You know, we got our own car. We could go on our own. You know what I mean? That's been the conflict between the Norte and the Bulldogs. And it's crazy because it's just like when you look at the Riders, you look at the New Flowers, you look at all these different groups, you know, and all these groups were at one time under the Norte Bandera, all of them. You know what I'm saying? So how does this occur? Imagine if all these groups were united as one. There was no favoritism, there was no set tripping, there was no disloyalty, there was no betrayal. These groups would flourish. Their numbers would swell in these yards, and you would be able to be more established out there. But all you see is continue to see people branching off, breaking away. They've made it easy. But the Bulldogs, you got to respect the Bulldogs in this aspect. They did this when they broke away during a time era when there was no SNY. So they would have to fight for everything they fought. You know what I mean? And both sides, you know what I mean? A lot of times Bulldogs, they would be outnumbered. You know what I mean? They'd get served, but then there'd be places where the Bulldogs would have a strong foundation. You know what I mean? You know, there was been different things that have happened. I mean, at one time you had the individual Pollo, who was a part of the BDN. You know, his stepdad was Fonzie, a Mexican mafia member. So people want to know why did at one time during the 90s, did the Bulldogs try to have a coexist relationship with the Sureños? I think that had a lot to do with it, because him and Mousy Morales were two of the main ones trying to push that BDN, Bulldog Nation. But the rest of the Bulldogs rejected it. All these dudes ended up getting deemed. Mousy ended up going to the feds. He tried to claim Norte, and then they whacked his ass in there. You know what I'm saying? In the feds. I think that was about a couple years ago. But you know, this is all just for perspective. It's all for people to debate. It's all for people to talk about. You know, and what's been embedded in both sides, whether you're a Norteño or a Bulldog, is to hate the other side. But y'all forget, y'all used to rock together. You all used to be on those yards where maybe there's 50 homeboys. You know what I mean? You're going to have to rely on each other because you're on a yard with 200 Sureños and it's cracking off. You know, times have changed, you know, with the end all hostilities, the interactions between groups and so forth, man. But people forget how fucking hard it was out there in these yards back in the 80s and 90s. It was not simple to go to prison, man. It was guerra all the time. It was cracking off. It was war. You were outnumbered. There was no like cool relationships of respect with other groups like you see today. Man, it was really, people were really getting it. So when the Bulldogs walked away, it was a big blow for the Norte, period.
Yeah, I know my first exposure to like set tripping like that was in Susanville, man, and in probably like February or March of '93. I pull up, there's like 5 homeboys from my hood from Pittsburgh, you know, and there was like 2 dudes from Concord there too that, you know, they just rode with us, you know. So we were like 7 deep. And man, I was out on the yard, man, my first week there, and I'm talking to another homeboy over by the weight pile. And I see all my homeboys stop looking at me, you know what I mean? And I'm like, you know, I'm tripping why they're looking at me like that. Finish my conversation, I catch up with them, we're walking laps around the track. They're like, hey, you know, we really don't kick it with them San Jose dudes. And I was like, oh, okay, my bad. I didn't know. You know, I'm pretty green, bro. I don't even know what to say. You know what I mean? Because I never heard nothing like that before. And man, that yard was really, really fractured, bro. It was us. We would kick it with Salinas in the East Bay, San Jose, and like all them other towns around there, Gilas, Morgan Hill. They would all kick it together. And it was fractured. Like each group basically had their own shot caller. You know what I mean? And it functioned like about 4 different groups of Northerners, man. And nobody really liked San Jose on that yard. It was a trip, bro. I'd never seen nothing like it. You know, when I ended up getting to the 3 yard, you know, I was schooled a lot differently. Obviously, the education level changes. And they were like, oh, they're tripping over there. They'll have to answer for that later. You know what I mean? But after my trip to Susanville, man, it's always been policy everywhere that it was any opportunity to engage with the Bulldog, whether there was a door policy at Pelican Bay, here, there, anywhere, you had to take it.
They were considered they were considered the number 1 enemy, like as if they were dropouts or degenerates.
Oh, above the Flowers, above everybody, it was Bulldog.
You know, the only thing that would have been higher than a Bulldog would have been a high prior NF dropout.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? One of those targets.
No, it was serious.
You know, And I think that kind of affected everything, because instead of being on these yards establishing a foundation, you know what I mean? Like places like Avenal, Pleasant Valley, it was just war at the time, man. You know what I'm saying? It was just cracking off.
Yeah, I know. I tripped on the door policy, man, in Pelican Bay. And the first time I was there, it only applied to us in the South Side umbrella. That's it. Like the AB, it didn't apply to them. You know, it was kind of on you if you wanted to do it, but they didn't care. It's just no. The rule, the first rule that I got was no being the aggressor against the South Side, the MA. You know, we really thought the South Side government was a big deal at that time. So no MA, no South Side government, no Serranos.
Yeah.
Unless they showed aggression. Everybody else, it was kind of at your personal choice. You know what I mean? But mandatory was Bulldogs, and then obviously dropouts. But Bulldogs were like,
Oh yeah.
we're stressed, bro. Like, you know, I think one of the questions me and Wino from Salinas had to do one day was, if your cell opens and there's an AB, a dropout, and a Bulldog, who do you get and why? That was like one of the assignments we had to break down. You know,
What was the answer?
It depended on the dropout.
That's what I was figuring.
Yeah, it depended on the dropout who you would get first. If it was like at the time, man, some big names that were ringing were Big Smiley and Pantera and all them. You know what I mean? But
But let's ask another.
there was
question.
no correct answer really. It was one of Tibbs'.
Yeah.
Tibbs like to fuck with you a little bit to make you think. You know what I mean?
Let me ask you this question: who would the MA's primary target be?
That's a good question. Probably people who took the stand on them.
Well, no. An NF member, a dropout, and a Bulldog.
Oh, are you talking about during the door policy though?
Yeah.
I would say one of their own, because they don't really want to be the first ones to break the door policy.
You know, I mentioned this before when we had the door policy. Part of the agreement that we had in Corcoran was, even if it was another group's basura, we were supposed to engage and handle our business. That kind of tripped me out a little bit.
I don't really believe in that personally.
It's not our business.
Well, I mean, why make more enemies? You have enough.
Yeah.
Let them deal with their own trash. We deal with the Northern Collective. Me and you always both say we don't mean it like that. It's just hard to refer to it sometimes off the top of your head. You have enough things that you got to deal with amongst your own. Let them worry about theirs, bro. I mean, that's my thing. Unless they've been disrespectful or we feel like they pose a threat, yeah, of course. But you know, if you got a Sereno that's in there talking shit to their big homies, they can deal with it, bro.
Yeah, most definitely.
That's my philosophy. But
so like, you know, it's the crazy thing, right? Is, you know, being a Norteno in the system around that time, you know what I'm saying? I never really had the chance to really have too many interactions with Bulldogs. One time I was in Salinas Valley, my vecinos, there were some Bulldogs, they were in the, and we chopped it up a little bit, you know, mutually respectful, right? But just the hate that's been created because of all the conflict and wars that occurred. I think the 90s had the biggest influence on the Norteño Bulldog separation. That now it's generational. Because of what happened in the 90s with all the stabbings and slicings and removals and people getting jumped on. I mean, depending where you went, how bad you were going to get it. Now that the hates became generational, and a lot of people don't realize how it started or what the reasons were. I mean, all it took was a green light coming from Pelican Bay. Hey, all Bulldogs have to get off our yards. That took fold and went everywhere. Yeah. I mean, could the NF have dealt with it differently? You know, I don't know. But now because of that, like I said, it spurned the thought and process of other groups to break away as well. You know what I mean? It created, sometimes what you think you're doing, you got to look at the consequences, what may occur later on down the line by your actions. You know what I mean? You may, like I said, I don't think anybody took into consideration they may lose yards. I don't think anybody took into consideration that this Fresno thing now is going to give other groups such as the Northern Riders, New Flowers, and all these other groups the idea to start on their own. You know what I'm saying? So I think you got to really look at that and look at where did everything really go wrong? You know what I mean? We know there was separation in the 80s and 90s, but why did they have to go this far? You know what I mean? Why
Lack of communication.
why did the NF feel it so important to become so strict under the Nortenos under its umbrella? Why? What was the purpose? Because what was going on for 20-something years was working. Why did they change that whole philosophy of making everything strict and being dictators? Everything that was being taught to us about oppression and aggression within our own is the same thing that you started to see, because I remember going to the system, you remember going to the system. There wasn't all this crazy household policies and yard policy procedures that you had to follow and reports you had to write. None of that. You had veteranos that were in their 50s. You didn't just lose the Fresno car because of all these changes with the salutations. When you dismantled the NR, you lost a lot of good solid OGs who'd been doing time for 20-something years, that knew how to be convicts, that knew how to get off when they got off. You go to a prison yard today, you're not going to see a dude in his 50s with a big old bro shot. That's unheard of. They're going to be all like 30 and under. When I was first hitting the system, oh, you would see OGs in their 50s and 60s, you know, big old bro shots. Hey, come here, youngster. You know what I mean? Giving you clutch and lacing you up. You don't see that. You don't have that experience no more. And a lot of it is what I'm saying is, why did they decide to have such strict policies under everybody in that group? Because in the 90s, it was not like that, bro. Anybody who's an old timer, you go to the shoe, you go to level 4, yeah, you're going to have to handle your business. You're going to have that piece ready, hooped up, whatever you got to do. You go to the oil, you know you're going to get educated, mandatory. But when you got to the main line, you had room to wiggle. As long as you did not punk out and defended the household at all cost, you know what I mean? The expectations for you as a Norteños were very limited. Just wear your boots every day, be up every day, post up at the pisser or the shower, that's it. When it's time to get off, let's get off. Because there's enough dudes that want to be pulled as NR members or structure that are out there that we could have do these hits for us.
And that's the program that the Bulldogs are running to this day.
Exactly.
And another thing too, man, that I was tripping on, man, is you know, you see now that in the federal, you know, the Bureau of Prisons, there's a option if the Bulldogs want to kick it with the homies or if they want to do their own thing. So I mean, is the love gone forever? Man, it's really hard to say, man, because I think, you know, if it was up to like Skip and a couple of the other OGs, bro, that are back there that are really intelligent, they would get them back in the fold. You know, because that's a strong, solid little army. Will it ever happen? Man, I can't call it.
No,
I think there's too much. I think there's too much shit that's.
They dropped the ball. What I'm getting at is they should have addressed it in the beginning. Back then, it could have been fixed, bro.
You know what, man? If it would have happened nowadays, say none of that shit happened until right now. The communication is so instantaneous in prison, it would have a chance to be resolved. You know what I mean? Back then, another thing too, everybody's sitting way back in Pelican Bay and all these places. It's hard to get at certain people to whoop-de-whoop to try to negotiate and be like, hey, you know, we think this dude's responsible for this, and you know, it has nothing to do with any kind of set tripping, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How can we work this out? Back then, that was a months-long process, and in them months-long processes, other shit was just happening and happening to the point where it got so much, everybody threw up the double middle finger.
Yeah,
on both sides.
I really think that the salutations and dismantling the NR caused a big backlash effect. When they made it everything's this, you know, Northerners to be responsible for the same expectations of a NR member, it really pushed a lot of OGs that have been doing time for years. You know what I mean? A lot of these, let's just keep it real. A lot of these OGs, yeah, they'd be all in their cell, heroin down at night, playing handball, but they knew how to program. They knew how to be convicts. They weren't politically obligated. They were there to do their time and defend the people when they had to. You know,
yeah, like you were saying with the OGs, man. Nowadays, shit that'll get you whacked. Back then, the OG would have just pulled you aside. Hey, youngster, you can't do that, and this is why.
Oh no,
you know,
it would take a lot to get whacked back then, bro.
Yeah, no, yeah, extreme amount.
You know, there was no cowardice acts or anything like that. I mean, people knew what to expect. You know, I think the Bulldogs were ahead of their time because they did all this before all the changes. Because before you, as a homeboy, like I said, being political, you know, following the bonds, being part of the chain of command, being part of the elite circle, they used to call it, those were all options. They weren't mandatory. You just, as a homeboy, came in and submitted your information and paperwork, and we're told some basic policies. They were basically given to you verbally. They weren't written like this and shit with about 50 different policies you got to follow. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think it just really changed things. I think that now it would be more even difficult for them to be brought back. And I think the Bulldogs' whole purpose and agenda was they seen what was coming down the line. They seen the results. You got to remember, there was a lot of NR members at the time that were abusing their authority. And a lot of times they were from a particular area that used to hate on Fresno. So there's a lot of things, man. It really isn't just one thing that I feel that caused the rift. I think it was a whole multiple of a lot of things. There's more things you could look at in the initial stages of the 80s, but up until 89, 90, they were still coexisting on the yards. You know what I mean? There's something that happened along the lines to where they totally decided to separate.
No doubt, man. It is what it is, man. I mean, things happen, man. You learn from them and move on. I mean, that's all you can do. You never know. Anyway, that's a little bit about the Northerners and the Fresno experience, and you know, some of the reasons we hear it happened and how it just snowballed into a point of no return. And like Flacco said, allowed a lot of other groups to take a look at that, a lot of other individuals before their groups to look at that and think, damn, we don't want to have to do all that stuff either. Let's go do our own thing. Fresno was successful. Nobody's been successful like Fresno, but there it is there. It's your boy Rojo, Big Flacco, Fresno, Norte. Hope you guys enjoyed this one, man. Have a good day.